The courtroom buzzed with the usual mix of tension and anticipation. Lawyers shuffled papers, witnesses sat nervously in the waiting area, and spectators whispered quietly among themselves, their eyes darting toward the front where the defendant stood. Judge Evelyn Harper adjusted her robe as she took her seat at the bench, her expression calm but authoritative. To most people in the room, this was just another day in court, a routine case of financial misconduct. But for Evelyn, it was about to become something far more personal. As the proceedings began, Evelyn glanced at the defendant. At first, he was just a face, another name on the docket. But then something caught her eye. His features seemed familiar, like a shadow from her past trying to step into the light. She leaned forward slightly, studying him more closely. That's when it hit her. The man standing before her wasn't just any stranger. It was Michael Carter, her childhood best friend. Memories came rushing back like a floodgate had opened. She remembered lazy summer afternoons spent riding bicycles down dusty country roads, their laughter echoing through empty fields. They'd built tree houses together, imagining they were explorers discovering uncharted lands. In those days, life felt endless, full of promise and dreams yet to be realized. Michael had always been the adventurous one, the boy who could talk anyone into anything. And Evelyn, she'd been the steady counterbalance, the voice of reason when his wild ideas threatened to spiral out of control. But time has a way of pulling people apart. When Michael's family moved away during high school, their connection faded. Letters stopped coming, phone calls grew rare, and eventually, they lost touch entirely. Years passed, and Evelyn went on to pursue her dream of becoming a judge, while Michael disappeared from her thoughts altogether. Until now. Her heart raced as she processed the surreal situation. Here he was, standing in her courtroom, not as the carefree boy she once knew, but as a man accused of embezzling millions of dollars. The contrast was jarring. How did someone so full of hope and kindness end up in this position? Was he guilty, or was there more to the story? Questions swirled in her mind, each one pulling her in a different direction. Evelyn forced herself to focus. This wasn't the time for nostalgia or second-guessing. She had a job to do, and that job required impartiality. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this case would challenge her in ways no other had before. As she called the court to order, her voice remained steady, betraying none of the emotions swirling beneath the surface. But deep down, she knew this trial wouldn't just test her ability to administer justice. It would also test her understanding of forgiveness, loyalty, and the complexities of human nature. Little did she know, what unfolded next would leave everyone in the courtroom speechless. The courtroom settled into a tense rhythm as the trial began, but for Judge Evelyn Harper, maintaining her composure was harder than ever. Every glance at Michael felt like reopening an old chapter of her life she thought was long closed. On the surface, she appeared calm and collected, her gavel poised in hand, ready to guide the proceedings with precision. But inside, a storm raged. Memories of their childhood clashed with the accusations against him, creating a whirlwind of doubt and confusion. Evelyn reminded herself repeatedly of her duty. As a judge, she had taken an oath to uphold the law without bias or favoritism. Yet how could she separate her feelings about the boy she once knew from the man standing before her today? She thought back to the countless times Michael had stood by her side when they were kids, the time he defended her against bullies, the way he always made her laugh even on her worst days. Those memories painted a picture of someone fundamentally good, someone incapable of the deceitful actions described in the charges. But the evidence presented so far suggested otherwise. The prosecution wasted no time laying out its case. They painted Michael as a calculating schemer who abused his position as CFO to siphon millions into offshore accounts. Charts, bank statements, and emails flashed across screens, each piece of evidence tying him closer to the crime. Evelyn listened intently, her expression unreadable, though her mind raced with questions. Was this really the same Michael she remembered, or had years of ambition and pressure warped him beyond recognition? Meanwhile, whispers spread among spectators. Some noticed the slight hesitation in Evelyn's voice when she addressed Michael, while others speculated about why the usually efficient judge seemed unusually reflective during breaks. A few even wondered aloud if she should recuse herself due to a potential conflict of interest. Evelyn caught fragments of these murmurs, adding another layer of pressure to her already heavy burden. During one recess, Evelyn retreated to her chambers, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Alone for the first time since recognizing Michael, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, searching for answers in her own eyes. "Stay professional," she whispered to herself, gripping the edge of the sink. But professionalism didn't erase the memories, or the lingering sense that something wasn't quite right about this case. Her thoughts drifted to the concept of fairness. Justice wasn't supposed to be blind to context. It was meant to weigh all factors carefully before rendering judgment. Still, favoritism had no place in her courtroom. If Michael was guilty, she owed it to society to hold him accountable. But if he wasn't, Evelyn shuddered at the thought of punishing an innocent person because of circumstantial evidence. When the session resumed, Evelyn doubled down on her focus, determined not to let her emotions cloud her judgment. She asked pointed questions, ensuring both sides had equal opportunity to present their arguments. Her tone remained neutral, betraying none of the turmoil within. Yet every time Michael spoke, his voice carried a hint of the boy she used to know, a faint echo of innocence that made her heart ache. By the end of the day, exhaustion weighed heavily on Evelyn. The trial was only beginning, but she already felt stretched thin, torn between her role as a judge and the ghost of her childhood friendship. As she packed up her belongings and prepared to leave the courthouse, she couldn't help but wonder, how much harder would it get before the truth finally came to light? And more importantly, would she be able to handle it when it did? As the trial moved into its second day, the prosecution continued to build its case against Michael. Each piece of evidence they presented seemed more damning than the last. Bank records showed large sums of money being transferred to offshore accounts linked to Michael's name. Emails revealed conversations where he appeared to discuss hiding funds and falsifying reports. To the untrained eye, it all pointed in one direction: guilt. But Evelyn couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more beneath the surface. Michael's defense attorney, a sharp and experienced lawyer named Sarah Collins, wasn't about to let the prosecution have the upper hand without a fight. During her cross-examination of the lead investigator, Sarah began poking holes in the seemingly airtight case. She highlighted inconsistencies in the timeline of events, pointing out discrepancies in dates and signatures on key documents. "If my client is truly guilty," Sarah argued calmly, "why do these records suggest someone else may have tampered with them?" The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as spectators exchanged glances. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her pen poised over her notepad. This new line of questioning intrigued her. If the evidence wasn't as solid as it initially appeared, then who else might be involved? And why would anyone go through such lengths to frame Michael? Sarah didn't stop there. She called her first witness, a former colleague of Michael's named Daniel Hughes. Daniel testified that Michael had often expressed concerns about unethical practices within the company. According to Daniel, Michael had been under immense pressure from his superiors, particularly Richard Langston, the CEO. "He told me he felt trapped," Daniel said, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "He wanted to report what was happening, but he feared losing his job, or worse." The mention of Richard Langston sent a ripple through the room. Evelyn's ears perked up at the name. Richard was a well-known figure in the business world, celebrated for his leadership and philanthropy. Could someone so respected really be involved in something so sinister? The idea seemed far-fetched, yet Evelyn knew better than to dismiss possibilities too quickly. As the day wore on, more cracks began to show in the prosecution's narrative. A financial analyst hired by the defense reviewed the bank records and identified irregularities, suggesting the transfers might have been initiated by someone with higher-level access, someone like Richard. The revelation forced the jury to reconsider their assumptions, and even the prosecution team looked uneasy. For Evelyn, this new information added another layer of complexity to an already challenging case. On one hand, she felt a flicker of hope that Michael might not be entirely responsible for the crimes he was accused of. On the other hand, the possibility of a larger conspiracy raised troubling questions. If Richard was behind this, what did that say about power, corruption, and the lengths people would go to protect themselves? Evelyn found herself reflecting on her own experiences with authority figures. Growing up, she'd always admired people in positions of power, believing they held themselves to higher standards. But life, and her career, had taught her that no one was immune to flaws. Perhaps Michael wasn't the villain here. Perhaps he was a pawn in a much bigger game. By the time the session ended, Evelyn's mind was racing. She walked out of the courtroom deep in thought, replaying the day's events in her head. The trial was far from over, but one thing was becoming clear. The truth was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. As she stepped into the cool evening air, she reminded herself to stay vigilant. Justice demanded nothing less. The next morning, Evelyn made a decision that surprised everyone in the courtroom. Just as the trial was about to resume, she requested a recess and asked for a private meeting with Michael in her chambers. It was an unusual move. Judges rarely interacted directly with defendants outside of formal proceedings, but Evelyn felt it was necessary. The weight of the case pressed heavily on her, and she needed clarity. Was Michael truly the man the prosecution claimed he was, or was there more to his story? She couldn't ignore the memories of the boy she once knew, nor could she dismiss the inconsistencies in the evidence presented so far. When Michael entered her chambers, the air seemed to grow heavier. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Evelyn gestured for him to sit across from her desk, and he did, his hands clasped tightly together. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "Michael," Evelyn began softly, breaking the silence, "I need you to be honest with me. Not just as a defendant in my courtroom, but as someone I once called a friend." Michael looked up, startled by her words. He swallowed hard before nodding. "I understand, Judge Harper," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But please, call me Michael. We're not strangers, even if it feels like we are now." Evelyn hesitated, caught off guard by his vulnerability. She had expected defensiveness or rehearsed explanations, but instead, she saw a man burdened by regret. "Tell me what really happened," she urged, leaning forward slightly. "If you didn't commit these crimes, then who did? And why are you being framed?" Michael took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to speak. "It's complicated," he admitted. "When I started working at the company, everything seemed fine. But over time, I noticed things weren't adding up. Richard, Mr. Langston, was pushing risky deals, cutting corners to boost profits. At first, I thought it was just aggressive business tactics, but then I realized how deep the corruption went. I tried to stay out of it, but they kept pulling me in deeper." He paused, his voice trembling. "They made it clear that if I didn't play along, I'd lose everything, not just my job, but my reputation too. I wasn't strong enough to stand up to them, Judge Harper. I should have walked away sooner, but I didn't. Now I'm paying the price." Evelyn listened intently, her heart aching for the man before her. This wasn't the same carefree boy she remembered, but she could see glimpses of him beneath the layers of pain and guilt. "Why didn't you report it?" she asked gently. "There are laws to protect whistleblowers." "I wanted to," Michael replied, tears welling up in his eyes. "But every time I thought about speaking up, they reminded me of what I stood to lose. My family, my future, it all felt like it was hanging by a thread. And when the accusations came, I knew exactly what they were doing. They set me up, Judge Harper. They used me as a scapegoat." The room fell silent as Evelyn absorbed his words. She believed him, not because of their shared past, but because his story aligned with the cracks in the prosecution's case. Still, belief wasn't enough. If Michael wanted a chance at redemption, He needed to cooperate fully. "You have to tell the truth in court," she said firmly. "Every detail matters. You can't hold anything back." Michael nodded, wiping his eyes. "I will," he promised. "Thank you for listening. I know I don't deserve your trust after everything, but thank you." As he left her chambers, Evelyn sat alone, staring at the empty chair where he had been sitting. Her mind raced with possibilities. This case was no longer black and white. It was a tangled web of lies, power struggles, and human frailty. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but one thing was certain. Justice demanded the full truth, and she intended to find it, no matter the cost. When the trial reconvened, the atmosphere in the courtroom felt electric. Whispers buzzed among spectators as they speculated about what had transpired during the unexpected recess. Evelyn returned to her seat at the bench, her expression calm but resolute. She carried herself with the same authority she always did, yet there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a quiet intensity that hinted at the gravity of what was to come. The defense team wasted no time capitalizing on the momentum from Michael's earlier testimony. Sarah Collins stood up and addressed the court, her voice steady and commanding. "Your Honor," she began, "we have uncovered evidence that points to a larger conspiracy within the company, one orchestrated by none other than Richard Langston, the CEO." The room erupted into murmurs, and even the prosecution team exchanged uneasy glances. Richard was a towering figure in the business world, known for his charisma and philanthropic efforts. Could he really be involved in such a scandal? Sarah called her next witness, a junior accountant named Lisa Martinez. Nervously adjusting her glasses, Lisa recounted how Richard had pressured employees to falsify financial reports. "He said it was for the good of the company," Lisa explained, her voice trembling. "But when questions started coming in, he told us to make sure everything pointed back to Michael. He made it clear that Michael would take the fall if anything went wrong." The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Evelyn listened intently, her pen scribbling notes rapidly. For the first time, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit together. The irregularities in the bank records, the inconsistencies in emails, the pressure Michael described, it all pointed to one conclusion. Richard had masterminded the scheme and used Michael as a scapegoat to shield himself from scrutiny. The prosecution tried to counter these claims, arguing that Michael still bore responsibility for failing to report the illegal activities. But their arguments lacked the same conviction they'd shown earlier in the trial. Even some members of the jury appeared skeptical, exchanging glances as if silently questioning whether they'd misjudged the case. Evelyn found herself grappling with a profound moral dilemma. Legally, Michael wasn't entirely innocent. He had participated in actions that contributed to the fraud, even if under duress. Yet ethically, it was becoming increasingly clear that he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Her mind raced as she weighed the options. Should she hold him fully accountable, or should she consider leniency given the coercion he faced? Justice demanded fairness, but fairness didn't always mean harsh punishment. As the day's session drew to a close, Evelyn announced that the trial would resume the following morning. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed around, eager to capture reactions from both sides. Meanwhile, Evelyn retreated to her chambers, her thoughts swirling like a storm. She stared at the stack of documents on her desk, each page representing a fragment of the truth. This case wasn't just about determining guilt or innocence. It was about understanding the complexities of human behavior, the choices people made when pushed to their limits. That evening, as Evelyn sat alone in her office, she reflected on the weight of her role. A single decision could change lives forever, not just Michael's, but also those who looked to the justice system for answers. She knew what she had to do, but it wouldn't be easy. Tomorrow, she would deliver her verdict, and with it, the hopes of everyone watching rested on her shoulders. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed to capacity. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and even the lawyers seemed unusually tense. All eyes were on Judge Evelyn Harper as she entered the room. her robe flowing behind her like a symbol of authority. The air buzzed with anticipation. Everyone knew this was the moment when justice would be served. Evelyn took her seat at the bench, her expression calm but unreadable. She glanced briefly at Michael, who sat stiffly beside his attorney, his face pale and drawn. Then she turned her attention to the jury, whose deliberations had concluded late the previous evening. They looked weary but resolute, their verdict sealed in an envelope now resting on her desk. But before the jury could deliver its decision, Evelyn had something to say. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and clear, "this case has presented us with difficult questions, not just about guilt or innocence, but about accountability, morality, and the complexities of human nature." The room fell silent as all heads turned toward her. We live in a world where choices are rarely black and white. People make mistakes, sometimes under pressure, sometimes out of fear. But it is our duty to ensure that justice reflects not only the law but also fairness. She paused, letting her words sink in. Her gaze swept across the courtroom before settling on Michael. "Mr. Carter," she continued, "you have admitted to participating in actions that contributed to this scheme. While you were coerced, your involvement cannot be ignored. However, the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that you were manipulated and used as a pawn by individuals in positions of power, individuals who sought to protect themselves at any cost." Evelyn's tone grew firmer as she addressed the broader implications of the case. "This trial has exposed a culture of corruption within your company, a culture perpetuated by greed and abuse of power. It is my hope that this verdict will send a message. No one is above the law, regardless of their status or influence." With that, Evelyn nodded to the foreperson of the jury, signaling them to rise. The foreperson stood, holding the envelope tightly in trembling hands. "Your Honor," he said, breaking the tension, "we find the defendant, Michael Carter, guilty of failing to report illegal activities, but not guilty of orchestrating the embezzlement scheme." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Evelyn nodded solemnly, absorbing the verdict. Turning back to Michael, she delivered her sentence. "Given the circumstances, including your cooperation in exposing the true architects of this crime, I am sentencing you to 3 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. Furthermore, you will assist authorities in their investigation into Richard Langston and others involved in this conspiracy." Michael exhaled sharply, relief washing over his face. Tears welled up in his eyes as he bowed his head, mouthing a silent thank you in Evelyn's direction. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, while spectators erupted into murmurs of surprise and approval. Some applauded quietly, moved by what they saw as an act of mercy. Others debated whether the punishment fit the crime. As the gavel struck, officially concluding the trial, Evelyn felt a mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, and a lingering heaviness. She had done her best to balance justice with compassion, but the weight of her decision lingered. As people filed out of the courtroom, she watched Michael embrace his family, gratitude etched across his face. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a small smile. Justice wasn't perfect, but today, she believed it had been served. The courtroom emptied slowly after the verdict, but Michael lingered near the exit, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Judge Evelyn Harper. She was gathering her papers, her movements deliberate and calm, as if trying to steady herself after the emotional whirlwind of the trial. Sensing his gaze, she looked up and met his eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. Words felt unnecessary. Then, with tentative steps, Michael approached her. "Judge Harper," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. What you did, it means more to me than I can ever say." Evelyn set down her folder and studied him for a long moment. The weight of the past weeks still hung between them, but there was also something else, a flicker of the bond they once shared. "Michael," she said softly, "you've been given a second chance. Don't waste it. Use this opportunity to rebuild your life, and maybe even help others avoid the mistakes you made." He nodded earnestly, tears welling up in his eyes. "I will. I promise. I already feel like I owe it not just to myself, but to everyone who believed in me, including you." Their conversation stretched longer than either had anticipated. They stepped outside the courthouse, away from prying ears, and found themselves reminiscing about their childhood. Memories of bike rides, treehouse adventures, and carefree summers brought a rare smile to Evelyn's face. It was comforting to see glimpses of the boy she once knew beneath the man standing before her now. Yet she didn't shy away from addressing the pain and regret that shadowed his expression. "You've been through something difficult," Evelyn said gently, "but hardship has a way of teaching us things we wouldn't learn otherwise. You've seen the cost of silence, the damage that happens when people look the other way. Maybe that's why this happened to you. Maybe you're meant to use this experience to make a difference." Michael listened intently, absorbing her words. He realized she wasn't just speaking as a judge. She was offering guidance as someone who genuinely cared. By the time they parted ways, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about moving on from the trial. It was about finding meaning in the chaos. In the months that followed, Michael threw himself into fulfilling his community service requirement. He volunteered at financial literacy programs, mentoring young professionals about ethical decision-making and the importance of speaking up against wrongdoing. His story became a cautionary tale, one he shared openly to inspire others to act with integrity. Slowly but surely he began rebuilding his reputation, determined to prove that he was more than the mistakes of his past. Meanwhile, Evelyn kept tabs on the investigation into Richard Langston and the company's corrupt practices. News outlets reported arrests and indictments, exposing the full extent of the scandal. While some criticized her leniency toward Michael, many praised her for balancing accountability with compassion. The case sparked broader discussions about corporate ethics and systemic corruption, leaving a lasting impact far beyond the courtroom. One crisp autumn afternoon, Evelyn received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Michael. In neat handwriting, he thanked her again for believing in him and enclosed a photograph of himself speaking at a workshop for aspiring accountants. On the back, he'd written, "You reminded me that people aren't defined by their worst moments. Because of you, I'm learning to define mine by what comes next." Holding the letter, Evelyn felt a quiet pride. Justice hadn't just been served, it had sparked redemption and growth. And though their paths might never cross again, she knew their shared history had come full circle. Months passed, and the echoes of the trial began to fade from public memory. Life moved on for everyone involved, but its lessons lingered like ripples in a pond. For Judge Evelyn Harper, the case remained etched in her mind, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the delicate balance between justice and humanity. As she walked through the courthouse halls each morning, she often reflected on how much the experience had changed her. The trial had tested her in ways no other case ever had. It forced her to confront her own biases, question her assumptions, and navigate the gray areas where the law met real-life struggles. Some critics still whispered that her ruling had been too lenient, while others argued it was proof that compassion could coexist with fairness. But Evelyn knew one thing for certain. Justice wasn't about perfection. It was about doing what felt right, even when it was hard. Outside of work, Evelyn found herself thinking more about Michael. She had heard snippets of his progress through mutual acquaintances and occasional updates in local news articles. He had become an advocate for ethical leadership, traveling to schools and businesses to share his story. His transformation amazed her, not because he had redeemed himself, but because he had turned his pain into purpose. Every time she read about another workshop he led or heard about someone inspired by his message, she felt a quiet sense of pride. Perhaps this was what justice was meant to look like, not just punishment, but growth and change. For Michael, life after the trial was far from easy, but it was richer than he'd imagined possible. The guilt of his past actions still weighed on him, but it no longer defined him. Instead, he channeled that regret into helping others avoid similar pitfalls. He spoke openly about the pressures he faced and the choices he wished he'd made differently, urging young professionals to prioritize integrity over ambition. "It's never too late to start over," he often said during his talks. "But starting over begins with owning your mistakes." Their renewed friendship also blossomed unexpectedly. Though their lives were worlds apart now, they stayed connected through letters and occasional phone calls. They shared stories, Evelyn about her courtroom experiences, Michael about his journey toward redemption. Their bond deepened, rooted not in nostalgia, but in mutual respect and understanding. Michael even sent her a small sapling one spring, writing in the note, "This tree represents new beginnings for both of us." Evelyn planted it in her backyard, watching it grow alongside her reflections on the case. As the years went by, the scandal involving Richard Langston unraveled further, leading to widespread reforms in corporate accountability. Companies began adopting stricter ethics policies, inspired partly by Michael's advocacy work. In a strange twist of fate, the trial that once threatened to destroy him became the catalyst for meaningful change. One evening, as Evelyn sat on her porch gazing at the stars, she thought about how interconnected everything was. A single decision, a single moment of recognition in a crowded courtroom, had set off a chain reaction that touched countless lives. Justice, she realized, wasn't just about verdicts or sentences. It was about creating opportunities for healing, learning, and growth. And though the world kept spinning forward, she carried those lessons with her always, a reminder that people are complex, life is messy, and sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most profound outcomes.